Hello everyone, my name is Stuart Harmon. I'm a partner at Oliver White Asia Pacific. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on business transformation in global organizations. Over the last several decades, with the evolution of globalization, many organizations have established subsidiaries, sites, offices and branches across the globe in a bid to establish themselves in the worldwide marketplace. Some have done this successfully, but many have not, with profitable growth hampered by hasty expansion, a lack of a cohesive strategy, disjointed practices, and inadequate cross-organizational communication. We'd call these organizations international, but not truly effectively global. The solution, global transformation, i.e. a program undertaken by an organization to enable it to work as an effective global organization, is easy to say, but not quite so easy to do. As consultants, being involved in one global transformation is usually the highlight of one's career. But to be able to draw on Oliver White's 50 years of experience in helping global organizations fundamentally change the way they work, and having hands-on experience in several global transformation projects, has been a fantastic opportunity that we'd like to share with you today, including some of the elements that make a difference between success and failure. Also, keep in mind that your company doesn't have to be a global organization to apply some of these learnings. If your business operates out of several sites and across multiple independent regions, then this equally can be applied to you. Following our presentation, we'll have a question and answer segment where we'll answer individual questions submitted by you. So whilst listening to today's presentation, I'd encourage you to submit questions at any time by typing in the comments section that you'll be able to see on your screen. Also, remember that today's webinar will be available on demand, so you'll be able to view it again at your convenience or share it with friends and colleagues. You'll receive an email with a link to access the webinar within the next few days. So now I'd like to introduce myself and welcome today's other speaker, my colleague Rod Hozak. So my name's Stuart Harmon. I'm based in Sydney, Australia. And prior to joining the Oliver White organisation, I spent almost 20 years working in key change agent roles in major manufacturing organisations around the world. I'm now lucky enough to have spent the last 10 years in my Oliver White life working with organisations across multiple industries and geographies, helping them improve their business processes, how they use those processes, and the outcomes they get. My colleague Rod is based in Sydney, Australia also, and he's got 15 years hands-on experience in the pharmaceutical industry and 20 years consulting experience as well. He's passionate about setting businesses up to win and helping people grow in knowledge and confidence to support that winning mindset. So Rod and myself have authored many publications, including the latest white paper from Rod, shown here on the screen, Business Transformation in Global Organizations, upon which we based the webinar that we're running for you today. If you go to the Oliver White website, you'll find papers on a wide range of topics written by us and our colleagues who are all experienced hands-on practitioners. The great thing about these is they're all available for download for free, so I'd encourage you to get on and have a look. So let's have a look at our agenda for our webinar today. So what are we going to cover? Well, we'll kick off with a brief overview of the Oliver White organisation, for those of you who don't know us. Then we're going to talk about our change methodology, the proven path, and the benefits of successfully deploying a global transformation. Next, we're going to have a look at the 4 key learnings that we've identified from some of our previous global transformation deployments. And then finally, as time permits, we'll answer any questions that you may have. During the course of the webinar, we'll be using real-life examples wherever we can to make it as real as possible without disclosing any confidential company information. So now I'd like to introduce you to our firm, Oliver White, an organisation that's been a thought leader for 50 years. In fact, this year we're celebrating our 50th anniversary, which we're pretty impressed with, given most consulting firms on average last about 15 years. So we've been around a while now. Ollie White founded the firm in 1969, and it quickly developed a global presence with a number of global initiatives, including organizations such as Caterpillar, Procter & Gamble, Merck Sharp & Dome, and global implementations, including organizations like Abbott Laboratories, DuPont, Avon, BAT, and General Mills, to name a few. There are around 60 of us, 60 associates around the world, who are all experienced practitioners with what we refer to as Class A credentials. This means that each associate comes from having a real job in industry, at a senior level in the organization, and has led a significant transformation project in their time. So it was Oliver White, along with Joe Orlicke, who invented MRP, or Material Requirements Planning, which is really one of the fundamental building blocks around planning systems. And Ollie went on to pioneer its use in industry and then build many more practices that are commonplace today. So the Oliver White organization invented or pioneered S&OP, Sales and Operations Planning, which has evolved to become Integrated Business Planning, which a number of our clients use today, and also Collaborative Planning, Forecasting and Replenishment. As an organization, we've had success across a range of industries and in many complex environments. The methodology and best practices have been proven many times over, not only with the technical outcomes achieved, but as one senior executive said to us on one occasion, this is a massive positive change in the organization that is not going away. So sustainability is really important. So let's get into today's topic. So a critical element of all transformation, that is independent of whether it's a large multinational company or a local medium-sized entity, at Oliver White, we use a well-proven transformation process that we've aptly called the proven path. So this model has been built on our 50 years of experience and has been validated against Kotter's 8-step model for change quite recently. There are 3 main phases to the approach. The first phase is the lead phase, followed by the transform phase, and then the own phase. All transformation projects have lofty goals that stem from the identification of the value opportunity. So this webinar is about how you consistently transform a global business. And the first lesson is that a proven methodology is needed to maintain that consistency. If left to each site or business unit to interpret the standard independently, then typically the results will be variable and uncertain. So there needs to be a standard which is objectively applied to ensure consistent delivery. So the goal is to ensure that the case for change, which is shown on the screen, is built, that the organization then becomes ready for change. The implementation is tested and applied. Then the implementation is consistent across the globe. And very importantly, that the result is sustainable. We've run another webinar recently on sustainability, so we won't go into too much detail on that at this stage. But if you're interested, I'd encourage you to go to our website where you can find that webinar and also the white paper that we've written on the topic. So the important message here is that there is a pathway and it must be used in every entity within the global organization. There are no shortcuts, and we'll talk more about that later on. So the same logic and approach needs to be applied to all programs. It doesn't matter whether it's an integrated business planning process implementation, whether you're improving demand management and forecasting, whether you're looking at the processes around product portfolio management or the extended supply chain or a lean implementation or any other specific transformation needs, the process is always the same and is usually based on answering 2 initial questions. The first of these is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? The second question is, what is the value we could release if we solve that problem? So as we show you now, we've done some meta-analysis of the impact of, or found some meta-analysis of the impact of IBP programs. And as you can see from the representation on the screen, from this analysis, the value release comes in a number of areas. Our clients would typically see a return on their investment in the region of hundreds, often thousands of percent. But this doesn't just materialize overnight. There need to be a few prerequisites to ensure success, and we're going to talk about that soon. So let's move into our first polling question for the day. And what we'd like you to do here, in order to give some context to the sections to come, we have a question for you in the audience. And the question is, obviously tuning into this webinar because you've got an interest in global or at least multi-site transformation. So thinking about where you are at the moment, take a moment to let us know your status. So what level of maturity are you currently at with global transformation consistency? So are you just starting on the journey? Are you restarting an initiative after a previous unsuccessful attempt? Are you immature but starting to gain some traction in your organization? Do you see yourselves as well on the way? Or are you, in that lofty air or rarefied air of successfully achieving consistent and sustainable global transformation and looking for further improvements? So if you can take a little bit of time now just to indicate where you think you are in terms of maturity at this time, we'll in a 60 seconds or so just check in and see where you think you sit. And I would point out at this point, it's not a case of being right or wrong. It's just a view on where you think you are. So if we can have a look then at the results, if we're able to, if anyone hasn't voted, we're just about to close the poll. So if you can just select the one that applies for you. Okay, brilliant. So interesting. Thank you for sharing. So we've got I suppose a sweet spot there. A number of you are just restarting after a previous unsuccessful attempt. So that's really good. Our intent then is to hopefully present some information as we go forward that'll resonate, maybe identify some of the things that you didn't do. For those of you who are immature or see yourselves immature but gaining some traction, there should be some content here that is going to help you continue to get that traction and push forward. If you're just starting on the journey, we've got lots of good things for you. And if you're well on the way, well, there's some pitfalls to avoid. So we'll look to draw out those as we go through the rest of the material. So thank you for that, much appreciated. So if we can go back now to the presentation. So now I'm going to hand over to Rod to take us through the key learnings.
Thanks, Stuart, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. These learnings are based on a number of global and regional transformations I've led or been directly participated in over the last 20 years, as well as the knowledge and experience gained from the many other Oliver White associates. When you consider how long a global transformation can take, many consultants struggle to get one under their belt in their career, but we've been lucky enough or privileged enough to be able to participate in quite a few. I've been involved in Abbott Laboratories, which was by far the biggest, 91 sites around the world, BAT, Caterpillar, Fonterra, and many more regional and local multi-site transformation programs. So drawing on that experience, we've pulled together the 4 key elements that create a platform for successful transformation, and they are defining the intent, gathering the background information, mapping out the organisation, and using a consistent deployment and implementation approach that Stuart shared with us earlier in the presentation. These may all sound like no-brainers to you, but as we'll discuss in more detail, they become critical to tick each one off thoroughly before moving forward. So defining intent is really important for painting a picture of the end game. One of the observations many of the transformations and change management programs we've seen is that companies embark on this change without precisely defining what they are going to change to and what the intent of that transformation is. There are lots of competing goals to consider, as indicated on the slide, and without being specific about exactly what the transformation is going to deliver, then the transformation will go nowhere. So as the old saying goes, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So the important point to understand is what is what you want the transformation to solve for you. And I'm going to give you a few examples on the next slide. One of the more recent global transformations we've engaged in is a medical device company, and they have a major objective to reduce global inventory. You might ask, well, isn't that an objective of all companies, big or small? And you'd be right. But in this case, the culture of the business was such that inventory didn't matter. A surgeon can't operate without all the parts or tools to do the surgery. So even if one part of the kit is missing, that's enough to make the whole kit unusable. So the mindset has been to have all inventory everywhere all the time. Well, the times are changing. Governments are putting pressure on pricing. A number of global mergers and amalgamations have escalated the amount of inventory in chain. There's a consolidation of manufacturing sites, warehouse and distribution optimization programs in place, and there is potentially billions of dollars of inventory that will never be sold. And this is not just for one company, this is for the industry. So the first company to address this going forward is going to be well ahead of the game. That's a significant strategic advantage for them. So some other examples, a large food manufacturer was looking to ensure there was regional purchasing power for an essential and commonly used ingredient, and hence wanted to aggregate regional view of demand, supply and inventory. A pharmaceutical company wanted consistency in process to improve decision making and a consistent strategic deployment mechanism. A heavy machine company wanted tighter integration of their vertical supply chain, and even though they owned every node in the supply chain, each node was playing games with their supply chain partners to optimize their own node, and yes, at the expense of the business as a whole. In a traditional supply push agricultural business, they wanted to be able to move to a more demand pull environment. So you can see that there are various tactical and strategic reasons for a global transformation. Each, if successful, has saved the company many millions of dollars and created greater competitive advantage to boot. So the important point to re-emphasize is that we need to define the outcomes expected, which will then guide deployment thereafter. Gathering background information is another one of those areas you would just think you'd spend a couple of days doing some desk research and you'd have it all at your fingertips, but don't be fooled. In many deployments, getting the background information can be a labour of love. And while it sounds counterintuitive, it actually makes sense. If the organisation was already in control and integrated, they probably wouldn't need a transformation program. So the assumption is the background information will not be in a central location. You'll need to allocate the time to source it bit by bit. And we'll talk about what that information is shortly. It's like a building block approach to sourcing the information, making sure the elements are identified and put in plan to be resolved, preferably before the program starts, but at least early in the deployment phase. So some of the key areas are such as whether the structure of the organisation is independent or vertically aligned, what decisions are going to be made where and in what time frame, what the key metrics are going to be and their definitions around minimum data sets, and understanding of the number of joint ventures, third-party organisations and hybrids thereof, and what things are going to be immutable, that is decided at a global level and deployed, versus discretionary, which means open to the decision making at a local level. So let's just dig into my top 10 criteria. And the way I like to describe these is, as I mentioned earlier, immutable or discretionary. So the immutable one, just to re-emphasize, it's a global policy or requirement or decision point that is made at the global level. So when you're structuring at a local level, we need to make sure that the expectations are communicated well and the structure's set up accordingly. So one of the examples we come across often nowadays is that many global companies want to control the brand, but are okay with how it goes to market. So that means the immutable definition is brand control, but the discretionary areas is the distribution mechanisms at a local level. So some further examples are gathering the number of sites, which is usually the standard starting point for most transformations. The common definitions of sites are such things as marketing and sales, storage and distribution, manufacturing, outsourcing, and joint ventures. In a global transformation, this is usually defined as immutable and mapped and controlled globally. Sometimes, however, there may be a global view of product, say into China or North America, but the distribution thereafter is managed locally. Or indeed, there may be the opportunity to restructure to optimise that supply chain. Aligned with this, it's also worth noting the number of employees, the number of products, the number of customers, suppliers, to get a feel for the complexity of that entity. The second one is the annual strategic planning horizon, which is typically 5 to 10 years and is usually immutable. But that may vary, for example, from requiring locally to a 2-year horizon, regionally a 5-year horizon, and globally a 10-year horizon. And there therefore needs to be a mechanism to make them all work together and align. Some companies, for example, like forestry, might even need a 25 to 30 year strategic plan because it takes that long to grow trees. The third point is agreeing the monthly management planning horizon. And this also tends to be immutable and defined as a no less than type criteria. For example, with our clients, it's becoming much more common for the management framework to be a rolling 36-month horizon, but in a global sense, it could be no less than 18 months at a local level and at least 36 months globally. The fourth point, defining what decisions are going to be made at a local, regional or global level and in what time period. This is really important. It's especially important if the organisation is moving from an environment where the local CEO or president or managing director has had complete control to a more interdependent model. These usually end up being as immutable. And the advantage of this as we're doing it is that it can be the foundation for defining the authority levels for escalation. And obviously the discretionary part is what occurs under those authorisation limits. The fifth point, with the need for global information sharing and decision making, the monthly and weekly information and decision making timetable is also usually immutable and defined in the sense of no later than a certain date. And if you've ever mapped out a global information process, it turns into a spaghetti diagram with all the entities. So it's important to have key dates well defined. The sixth point, defining standard key metrics is another one of those that should be straightforward and easy to do. But I'd suggest this gets underway before the deployment, and there is a lot of time allocated defining the key process, operational, and strategic metrics and their definitions, tolerances, targets, and owners during the program. But because for some reason it always seems to take longer than first thought, and there are always people with exceptions and deviations that they'd like to toss into the mix. The seventh element is agreeing the minimum data levels and data transfer protocols. To me, this always has to be immutable. If it is not considered, it is inevitable that the transformation will get stuck in not being able to compare apples with apples. In one organisation we worked with recently, half the business had a foundation set of data and hierarchies already defined in their ERP systems. But the other half of the business had 8 ERP systems, all with different numbering systems, hierarchies, and transfer protocols, including a lot of data being held in spreadsheet. I'll leave it to your imagination to decide which one had a better result. The 8th point is agreeing the management of the product portfolios we talked about earlier, global, regional, or local. We've seen variations of this from complete local autonomy to complete global control and still work effectively. As mentioned above, however, it's becoming much more frequent that global brand and price control is becoming the norm in global organisations. Number 9, if manufacturing is predominantly done locally, then setting time fences and the rules around change could be discretionary. But more often than not, our global clients have global manufacturing, sourcing, and warehouse and distribution entities. And that means that time fences and the rules around changing plans must be immutable, otherwise it becomes chaotic. And finally, the aggregation and family hierarchies, the definitions of those, it's similar to the data one. In most cases, this has to be immutable to ensure you're comparing apples with apples, but with the capability and flexibility of modern technologies, rigid hierarchies are becoming less of a problem. You will still need, however, to have some form of definition to ensure consistency in reporting. The important point is that we need to get agreement on this before getting too much into the transformation. Sometimes I hear, oh, look, just get started and refine as you go. That might be okay for a single entity, but it just doesn't work if your goal is to truly transform the business globally. It will come back to haunt you if they're not addressed. Excuse me. Another area to make sure there is agreement on in the information gathering stage is the value discipline. And I know this is more strategic in nature, but the questions we need to ask and answer are things like, are you primarily a company that is driven by operational excellence and driving costs down, such as a McDonald's? Or are you customer intimate and driven by customizing products to individual customers, such as Morgan Cars, for example? Or are you driven by product leadership, such as BMW, who just want to make the best product, full stop? Defining this will shape the overall objectives of the transformation, help guide the immutable and discretionary items, and indeed the future structure of the organisation. This could, however, be the subject of a whole set of other webinars, so I won't go into detail here. The important point to note is that this decision has profound impact on what type of people and capability will be required, what type of processes will be required, and what types of tools and technologies will be required. And if the transformation is to move from, say, operational excellence to product leadership, for example, it will significantly complicate the transformation. So it's absolutely critical to find and drive towards the primary value discipline right from the beginning. So I'll now hand back over to Stuart to take us through mapping out the organisation and managing the global deployment.
Thanks, Rod. Well, wow, there's a lot of wisdom just in that section you've been through alone. So hopefully that's of use to those of you who've joined us for the webinar. Now let's think about how we get this down on paper. So a lot of considerations there, but let's start actually recording it. So the normal approach to global transformations is just to map out the supply chains. And that is important, and we'll come to that in a moment. But increasingly in this more aware global world, it's important to map out the whole value chain. So both the current state, which we refer to as the as is, and the to be, or what we want that value chain to look like. So that gives us the opportunity then to really create that structure and think it through for the future to ensure that what we're coming up with is going to match the value discipline that we're going after, to make sure that we're going to control those immutable items that Rod's just taken us through. And also we're going to liberate the business units or the opcos with the discretionary areas. So identify where they maintain some control. And most importantly, be clear on decision-making and escalation criteria. So this should not only take into account the physical supply of goods, but also where and how support areas such as infrastructure, HR, technology, and procurement are going to work. So after we map the value chain, we then also need to map out in detail the global supply chain. So in a physical goods environment, supply chain is important. It's actually important in a service industry as well, but tends to be more focused on from a physical goods perspective, because this is the opportunity for us to understand across the globe how it currently works and how we might optimize the supply chain for future competitive advantage. So, don't be fooled by this one. It seems simple, but we usually get a few strange looks when we ask our clients. So, do you understand your supply chain? And that's primarily for two reasons. If we're talking to the operations and supply chain people, their response is usually, well, yeah, of course we do, because we work in supply chain. You'd be amazed how many times they don't fully understand the supply chain. And then if we're talking to sales and marketing, and even to some senior executives, their response is often, well, do I need to understand the supply chain? So to us at Oliver White, we see understanding the supply chain as a need that needs to be universal across the business, because it's in fact a major source of competitive advantage or competitive disadvantage if we get it wrong, and needs to be addressed during the preparation phase then of our global transformation efforts. So mapping it out, that helps us drive an understanding of what those fundamental drivers are for the supply chains. And we say supply chains plural because there's rarely only one single supply chain. And that's the element when we talk to supply chain teams, they're often unaware of or haven't really thought through. We get not only a picture of the multiple plan, source, make, deliver, return perspectives, but also the relationships up and down the supply chain, so we can better understand what we want that 2B model to look like. So the next stage is we need to fold in the decision-making criteria that Rod spoke about earlier. So to support the decision-making approach agreed, the management matrix will need to be mapped out, i.e. how the annual, monthly and weekly management processes are going to be integrated, so there's seamless local to global decision-making and communications. So on the screen here, we've depicted a simple monthly and weekly process. You can see global, region, country, sub-location depicted there. You don't need to be Einstein to work out, however, but the time you've mapped out the many business units or operating companies around the world, this is going to get very complex. Rod mentioned 91, I think, in the Abbott example. So, do it up front and refine it then as you deploy out through those different parts of the global organization. So as Rod mentioned earlier, working out what decisions are going to be made where is important to do up front, especially if the organization is predominantly to be driven by, or has predominantly been driven by, local general managers operating independently. This is going to be a real challenge for some people in the organization to go from complete autonomy to what could be best described as interdependence. This is a big behavior change. So we did this for one global organization, literally in a half-day session. So we got a cross-functional, cross-regional group of people together to brainstorm all the decisions that get made in the business every day. Not to critique them, just capture them and write them down. Then the group then grouped those into like decisions, so similar decisions, and allocated them to one of the cubes in the matrix that we're showing on the screen here. Then when defining the management structure shown on the previous slide, this guided the information that was reviewed in each of those management forums and in what time frame, and established the basis for the global escalation criteria. So what would go from local to regional and regional to global, and then what would come down global to regional and regional to local. So this exercise is one that's very valuable actually for any organization to take, not just an organization that's thinking about global transformation. Our overwhelming experience is that the question of who should be making decisions and when can be better understood in just about every organization. We continually see businesses where the who and when of decision making is unclear, with the result that the executive team get dragged down into very detailed daily and weekly level decisions, and they get copied on every email, for instance. So having your executives work below their pay grade and having them overwhelmed through the volume of emails they receive actually isn't the most effective way to use those people who are probably the most expensive people assets that you have in your business. So we've already mentioned that we need a proven methodology for deployments. I talked about our proven path earlier. This is an area that a lot of organizations get wrong. They think that they can deploy a pilot and then the rest of the business units or opcos will just pick up from their learnings by applying the templates that have been generated from the pilot activity. Now, this doesn't work, right? Generally, it can be improved upon. And why do we say that? So we think about transformations. What's the element that takes the longest? Is it deploying tools and software systems? Is it process design, or is it the people and behavior piece? Well, of course, it's the people and change management element that's the hardest part. That's why it's called a transformation. So the lesson is that every opco must go through every step of the proven path. Some of it, such as metrics, data definitions, decision making, might already have been drafted and or defined as immutable. But everyone needs to be engaged at each deployment and be allowed to go on their own journey. Skimping or shortcutting, that's definitely going to defeat the effectiveness of the change process. So yes, you need to pilot and learn, but for each rollout thereafter, follow the proven path. Use subject matter experts, or SMEs, to accelerate the rollouts. And then make sure you have mechanisms in place to continue to learn and iterate deployments all the way through, even to feed back to the original pilots. There's a lot can be learned from subsequent deployments and then implemented in those areas that went first. So transformations are not a destination, but it's a new way of working. And one of the most important aspects of sustainability is the continual pursuit of improvements. So now a final word on technology. So at Oliver White's, we're at pains to emphasize the people and behavior part, as I just said, as being critical. And it's actually the hardest to shift. Once that's done, then defining process with a set of people who are engaged and identifying the tools needed becomes easier. So we'd highly recommend thinking about the tools and technologies actually right at the beginning, and then being prepared for installation of those as soon as the new ways of working are defined. Now, it's not to say that tools and technologies come first. That's also a mistake. We've got to work on people and behavior and then process. But the point is that we used to be able to get away with a big lag in technology application. But in today's highly evolving technology environment, narrowing this lag is now becoming a critical element in maintaining a competitive advantage. And that's the objective of the transformation typically. So that concludes our webinar content for today. On behalf of Rod and myself, thanks to everyone who's dialed in. Thanks for attending. In the next couple of days, let's keep a lookout for the email. We'll send you with a link to access this webinar on demand. If you have any questions, and I've seen a few people have sent questions to you, so thank you. We'll try and get through as many of those as we can in the time that's left. So just looking at what's come up, I've got one here. And I might throw this over to you, Rod. So we've got a question. We're already on the journey, but we haven't addressed some of the immutable elements that you've called out. So what's your advice?
Oh, well, depending on what they are, but we need to go back and gain at least a draft and reshare with the organisation. One recent example with a large local company, it's a global company out of New Zealand, but we didn't quite get the KPIs properly addressed, although we drafted them, but there was confusion out in the market within a few months of sending them out. So we brought the team back, redrafted them, reworded them, and went all the way back up to the lead team to get them signed off and agreed that they'd be the driving metrics. In this case, they were predominantly the process and operational ones. The strategic ones were coming a little later on.
Yeah, great. And that's really all about that clarity piece, isn't it? I mean, if we haven't got to the immutables, then there's just confusion. We don't know who should be doing what and at what level.
Yeah, I'll also toss in, we do talk about the proven path a lot. Sometimes as we're going through multiple rollouts, we won't quite have addressed an area as well as we could have. the advice is always go back along that proven path, pick out which bit we haven't quite done, and then redeploy, re-implement, rework that one, and then start moving forward again. So I find that as a consultant to be a useful guide.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks for that, Rod. So another one we got here. Time for one more question, I think. So, so we've got this conundrum of the people doing the transformation also have to be part of the change as well. So, is there a conflict of outcome that we see in that instance?
Are you asking me? Or are you
Yeah, sorry, Rod. Yeah.
That's right. Well, there is a conflict, and the advice in the early stages is that it's quite easy to drop, for especially the senior leaders, to drop into the mechanics of what we're doing, sticking to timetables, getting process right, making sure the data and the systems work. What I'd often recommend to organisations is allow the teams, the deployment teams, to work on those kind of things, but define the behavioural change we as a lead team are going to lead, and don't drop into that detail about how we, so much into that detail about making sure we stay on track and getting the mechanics right. So what I'm doing is pushing that back up to the lead team to say, define and lead that. And there's a thing called the ripple effect, which says if the lead team is seen to be doing this, then it ripples to everybody else quite effectively.
Yeah, yeah. I will say to my clients, people do what the lead team do, not what the lead team say.
Yeah.
So it's all about modelling that behaviour, and I think some of those immutables are the challenge for a local GM who's had full autonomy now, working within a different system. Is one of those big examples of that. And if they're unhappy with that, if they white ant it, then we end up with the whole opco or business unit white anting the new global way of working, which is
correct.
is not productive.
So
I'm just going to time for one more. Just sounds like a lot of work, all this. So is it really necessary? And I want to comment on that one. We talked a little bit about sustainability. There's quite a lot of effort involved. You don't get this stuff for free. The payoff, though, is massive when you get it right. But if we think about having that continued return on investment, a number of the things we've talked about are around ensuring that everyone knows what they have to do, and we've really embedded this new way of working in the organisation. If we put the effort in up front, we get there a lot quicker, and then we need to hold that way of working so the benefits continue to come. So there's nothing more frustrating from a consultant's perspective, from our perspective, when organizations go through all the hard work and then they let things slip. So a big part of this has to be embedding this new way of working, so that if a couple of key people leave the organization, it doesn't go away. And that's really what all that preparation stuff we've talked about, defining the immutables, mapping, understanding, ensuring we've got full engagement across the organization. That's what's really important, because you can waste a lot of money making this happen and then letting the process fall apart again. So unfortunately, we see when organizations don't do it well, as personnel change, the impact of the original transformation wanes, and they cease to see the full benefits coming through. So look, thanks everyone. I think that's all we've got time for. Really appreciate you all using part of your morning or part of your afternoon to join us. If you have any questions, please reach out, and look out for that email coming through. And hopefully you'll be able to join us for our next webinar, which will be in the next couple of months. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.